Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brianna Martin. I'm the Senior Marketing and Events Manager at Mighty Citizen. So we're here today to talk about content governance. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to just go over a couple housekeeping items. So this is a very robust presentation. We should have, we're hoping to have around 10 minutes for questions at the end. And we might go a little over, so you're welcome to stay on for that. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation to ensure they're not missed, please post them in the Q&A area of Zoom as opposed to the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end of the presentation. The slides, a link to the recording, and a few other tools are going to be sent to all attendees and registrants in the next, actually tomorrow. So don't feel pressured to take any notes. And I think that is it. So I'm excited to introduce you today to our speakers. We have Jenny Powers, a digital project manager at Auburn University, the Harvard College of Business. And then Andrew Buck is our content strategist here at Mighty Citizen. He's going to be leading the webinar today. So Andrew, the mic is all yours.
Yeah, hey everybody. Thanks for attending. And so content governance, how to manage your digital content for success is the name of this. We went back and forth on a number of names because there's a lot of ways to attack this topic. And we're going to kind of presume for the purposes of this webinar that that you might have some knowledge of content governance, but I want to be really upfront with y'all and say that to really craft a robust content governance plan and implement it in your organization takes real time. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but what I really hope we can do is establish some fundamentals and establish really the value of pursuing smart content governance. So with that said, I want to start with a couple of sort of assumptions that we're going to make throughout this. And the first is that marketing online is as much about how, when, and where you say things as it is about what you say. There's been such a focus for the last 10 to 15 years, especially on content, on creating content, content marketing, content strategy. That's all very important. But as we have sort of internalized the need for creating important things that we put out into the world, we have sort of done that at the expense of thinking about context, the how, the when, and the where of what you say. So this is the first sort of thesis that we will be operating under, and hopefully we'll prove this case to you. And I'm happy to talk about it even after this webinar about why I think this is true. But we strongly believe here at Mighty Citizen, having witnessed this for years, that you can increase engagement, however you define engagement, by instituting content governance, right? That if you do that, it will ensure, or at least get you closer to ensuring, that you were saying the right things, the right ways, the right locations to the right people, or effective, and ideal, right? Content governance is the scaffolding by which we ensure all the fun stuff, that is the stuff we have to say, gets placed in the right context, in front of the right people, and all of that happens as efficiently as possible. So with that in mind, I do want to start with a quick poll that Brianna is going to push out. We'd like to get a little temperature. The four industries that Mighty Citizen specializes in are nonprofits, governments, associations, and higher ed. So I'd just love to get a sense if you could tell us which of those industries you work in, or of course, if you don't work in any of them, you can select other. We'll just leave that up for 10 seconds or so. And then I'll introduce myself and our lovely co-speaker here. Okay, so in the time we gave y'all to answer that, a lot of responses, a lot of nonprofit. That's lovely. Some government, associations coming in a second, higher ed down there, and other. Okay, cool. That's great. Don't worry. This is a pretty generic, I should say, presentation. The truth is, though, that we have versions of this that we deliver to higher ed audiences, to nonprofit audiences, to government, and to associations, because the truth is content governance is such an organization dependent endeavor that the different structures of your various industries really do matter. So, but we're going to try to cover things that are true across all organization types today. So I will pause and let Ginny introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name's Jenny Powers. I'm the digital project manager for the Harvard College of Business at Auburn University. And we did a website redesign and worked with Mighty Citizen a couple of years back, and were able to implement a content governance plan that they helped us construct, and it's been absolutely beneficial. So like to pass it on to Andrew so we can get this going.
Yeah, we're going to hear from Ginny throughout. She has such direct experience with this, and she's going to have, I think, some nice practical insights that are hopefully helpful to all of you. Yeah, my name is Andrew. I'm a content strategist here at Mighty Citizen. If you don't know, Mighty Citizen is a branding and digital transformation agency. We're based out of Austin, Texas, where, as you heard, it is the first day of fall officially, and it feels like the first day of fall. I went to the University of Texas, and I've been doing this kind of work for about 2 decades now, even though I know I look like I just graduated college. Okay, so let's move forward. So here's the agenda. Here's what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. If by the end of this session you can do these things, I'll be very happy. First is place governance in the context of content marketing. Second is to list the problems that you can solve by pursuing good content governance. Number 3 is begin to prepare. This is kind of like prepare to prepare. Like, here are the things you need to do before you dive into governance planning. And then we'll talk about what we can think of as sort of the 4 evergreen, always true things that need to go into a governance plan. Okay. So I do want to set up a little context to begin with. You can see on the screen here the amount of content that's going onto the internet every 60 seconds in 2021. The numbers, of course, are staggering. They're only accelerating across an increasing number of platforms. And I share this with you in order to remind us all who do professional communications, especially online, that we have to stop thinking about our competitors as like what we used to think, the sort of old traditional, if we're a university, then our competitors are the colleges in our state, or if we're a nonprofit, our competitors are the other nonprofits that cover our issue area. No, you are competing with content writ large. You're competing with everything that's on Facebook and every text message and every excuse that the people you're trying to connect with have to ignore you. Okay, so I want to set that as part of the stage. Now, the good news is you only have a few types of content to manage. This is actually just a sliver. We just kind of threw them up on the screen a bit willy-nilly. And the truth is that you're probably not doing some of these. That's totally fine. There's probably some that you're doing that aren't represented here. That's totally fine. But again, we're trying to get ourselves into the mindset of like, okay, this is a real beast. If we're going to compete on the internet for the hearts and minds of what are now mostly strangers to our organization, then we're going to have to admit that we're up against it and admit that there is a lot that we need to take control of. Now, there's some good news coming, so I'm not trying to make us all panic. I do want to acknowledge right off the front this book that some of you may have encountered before. It's called Content Strategy for the Web, and it's by Christina Halverson and her team from Brain Traffic, which is an agency that focuses on content strategy. I mentioned this book because it remains sort of the industry standard for how to approach the whole notion of content strategy. Now, notice it doesn't say governance, it's strategy writ large, but I do want to recommend the book, especially the newer editions, because it came out like over 10 years ago originally. But before we jump into that and talk more about it, I want to pause and let Ginny establish some of her context for how Auburn University has thought about this.
Yeah, so definitely for us, where the Harvard College of Business, we had a renaming in 2017. So we finally were branded Harvard College of Business. Before that, we were Auburn College of Business. So we've really had to change how we approach our content. It's become our brand, it's our story, it's how we present ourselves. We also need to guide our audiences to the content they need when they need it. And really, we have several different audiences. We have not just prospective students, we also have alumni. So we're really moving more towards how we can focus on advancement. And we also want to use our content to inspire business, thought leadership. We have a lot of great research faculty on our in our college. We're a tier 1 research institute. So that's really been how we look at content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I really love about that, by the way, is it reminds us that, so often organizations, when they move towards that word content, they think of it in terms of like tactics, like, oh, we need to be doing podcasts or we need to be writing blogs, which is all great, but those are tactical. This is an example here at the Harvard School of tying your content tactics to larger organizational goals. So I think that's a good segue into establishing the context. So we have to understand, for this to truly be effective in your organization, whether you're in a you're a one-person shop or a large institution with multiple divisions, I think we have to approach it this way to be truly effective. And the first is by borrowing what we think of as the content quad, right? So if we think of our core content strategy as sitting in the middle, there are 4 sort of pillars upon which it sits. On the left, we have what we think of as the content component. So that's the substance and structure. And then on the right, what we think of as the people components, the workflow and the governance. So I want to talk a little bit about the left side before we jump into more detail on the right. So if we think of the core strategy as like what connects all of the components of our marketing or communication efforts, it's really the guiding light. It needs to ladder up to organizational goals. I can't state that enough because, often when we work with a new client, one of the very first things you want to understand is like, to what end, right? Why are we doing any of this work? And often we find that their goals aren't very specific, or they might not exist, or really often we'll see that they're kind of outdated. Oh, we did a strategic planning 2 years ago. This is what we're working with. Well, until we establish those goals, and there's no purpose in developing any sort of content strategy, let alone a governance plan. So how do you develop that? Well, one approach is the achieve, be, do. Now, by the way, the core content strategy can be a pretty it often just takes the form of like a sentence or 2 or 3. This isn't some big crazy long document, but we need to have it in order for the governance plan to know where to go, right? So the achieve, be, do says you answer 3 questions. What does your content strategy need to accomplish, right? What goals are we trying to accomplish? The B is what content products will you create, and how are they valuable? Especially how are they valuable to our audiences? I think Ginny alluded to that too. And then finally, the do. What will our organization need to do to support content projects? And that one is often overlooked because it's like, well, we just need to make the content. Well, depending on where you are in your content journey, whether it's fully fleshed out and developed or you're just beginning to move toward it, the truth is that there are sort of operational shifts and often a culture shift. We're going to talk about that a bit later. But if you can answer these 3 questions, often you have the bulk of what could make up a core content strategy. So once you have that, then you can really get into the details, the tactics, the solutions, the concerns, what kind of content should we create? And the way to answer that question, of course, is what do our audiences need and want from us. So once you do all that fun brainstorming, where what we could do, we do podcasts, and we do blogs, and we publish research papers, and we have continuing education classes, and maybe we should invent a new credential that we offer, et cetera. Then we ask, what do these tactics have in common, right? We do all of our brainstorming, get everything out, and then we ask, what do they have in common? That's a nice question to ask, because if you can't answer that for a particular content piece, then it probably shouldn't be pursued. It shouldn't be a part of your lasting plan. You know, what themes underlie them? This is really nice, because if you have a lot of institutional knowledge, in other words, you have people who've been working in your organization for some time, they can often identify content products that you should produce that are thematic without even realizing they're thematic, because they've sort of internalized what your users need. Now, I have to say, I'm going to use the word users a fair amount, and I don't love that word, but it really is the most all-encompassing word, because I know for some of you, you're thinking of students, for some of you, you're thinking of donors, some of you are thinking of members, so we'll round it up to users. And then here's just a fun question. If we didn't have to do these things, what would we like to do instead? In other words, we need to be a bit aspirational with this content strategy. You know, if we could solve all of our users' current problems instantly, what would we do next? These are the kind of questions that will not only allow you to identify the content products you should be creating, but of course, the plan that will get you there. So again, get aspirational. You don't say we want to provide information for nurse practitioners. You say something like, we will be the most trusted resource for new to profession nurse practitioners, helping them quickly transform into ethical expert leaders at their clinics and hospitals. So let's use our words here. Let's get a bit big. Let's get a bit bold. And let's get a little bit more specific. Okay. So that's the core content strategy to start. Now we begin adding on to it. So let's talk about substance first. In order to determine what content you need, you first need to know your audiences, right? You want to get specific, but only as specific as is relevant to your goals. Then you need to prioritize them. The prioritizing often doesn't happen, or at least it happens in theory when you're doing your strategic planning, but it doesn't always carry its way through. For example, if you're a university, prospective students are probably your primary audience. Parents are a secondary audience, but you have to determine how far back are they. And the reason you need to know that is because it's not only going to guide what types of content you produce, but of course it's going to influence planning, like what channels you're producing this content on, promoting it on, publishing it to. So you have real clear, specific notions of who your audiences are and their priorities. Then you work on messaging. This is the thing that I think most people think of when they think of content, right? The thoughts and ideas you want your audiences to remember. The key word there is remember. So often in our organizations, we have a million things we'd like to say, but the people we're trying to connect with don't care about a million things. They probably care about 3 things. So what's great about doing something like a messaging platform is you establish what those 3 things, those 5 things are, so that you can hammer them home again and again and again. Topics, right? How do we get those key messages out in different ways? You do some brainstorming, you narrow it down, persuade versus inform. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because it's not, the core message of this webinar. But again, if you go read content strategy for the web, there's some more tactics available there to you. Another thing that comes into substance is voice and tone. We're going to talk about voice and tone at the end, because I think it often gets misunderstood, and it can actually be helpful. It's not one of those strategic planning exercises that you do in a conference room once every 2 years and forget about. It can be really useful. So this is what I think a lot of people think of when they think of content, is the substance. But now let's talk about the other 3 parts, okay? So the next is structure. I want to first, before we jump into that, I want to say that I feel the need to often say this in whatever presentation I'm doing, but that your website should be your organization's most effective and efficient salesperson. Often websites get ignored, or I shouldn't say ignored. It's rare for an organization to ignore their website, but they don't love it the same way that I think that they should love it. Remember, your organization's website is on 24/7, 365. It costs less per hour than any employee in your organization, probably. And if treated well, it can do amazing things. The problem is it often, by the organization itself, gets overlooked as a real powerful source of connection. And that's often because organizations build their website according to how their peers and competitors build their website. Now, I mentioned the website specifically because I want that to be the focus of our conversation today. We got another poll here. The question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being perfect, I'd love to know how you would rate, and by the way, this is anonymous, right? We don't know who said what, but how would you rate the quality or effectiveness of your organization's current website? So 10 being perfect, 1 being totally useless. I wish I could burn it to the ground. Let's give it 5 more seconds. We'll do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's look at these results real quick. Got 5 was the most popular answer, right down the middle. It looks like 6 is close, 7, okay. Look at that, no 10s, only 3 9s out of all these people here. So that's very telling. That means that you're right. There's things that can be improved. There are things that are working. And I mention all of this because when we talk about content governance, I want us to think about it in terms of your website. Now, I understand that most of you on the call today probably produce content that doesn't show up on your website. Maybe that's print material. Maybe that's stuff that only exists on social, or maybe it's even stuff that only exists in your email marketing. I don't know. But if you can get your website's governance right, then all the other types of content you manage are so much easier to manage. The website is the most complicated piece of content that you have. So let's talk about it just for a brief moment. Structure is really that question. How will the things you put out into the world be structured? And I can't remember what we said at the very top. The how, the what, the where, the when of what you say is at least as important, often more important than what it is you're actually trying to communicate. So, this is just a collection of some of the things you need to consider. How will each audience navigate to your website, right? How do they get there? Do they land on the homepage? How do you know where they're landing, right? How is it, you're just looking at your analytics? Are there other sources of that data? When a new page comes on into existence, where on your website should it live? Again, how do you know? Governance is going to help us answer some of these questions. How might certain types of content be reused? This is kind of a buzzword in the content marketing world, the idea of repurposing content. What does that really mean? And how do we get there? And does it actually make us more efficient? The structure portion of the quad here is concerned with things like channels, technology platforms, and content formats. So we also could throw in here, of course, social media, email marketing, print. We're thinking of website right now, but then technology platforms are, what is the CMS that your website uses to manage, that you use to manage your website? What third-party software integrates with your CMS and with your website? Do you have a member portal or a student login, something like that? These are the kinds of things we need to have a very, very clear understanding of to be effective. And of course, what do we even call all of this is an important question. So I want to talk for a second about something that I mentioned. It seems like in every single presentation I do. It's called the curse of knowledge. And it goes like this. If you know something, or if you come to know a thing, then it is impossible to imagine what it was like not to know that. That is the curse of knowledge, right? I am cursed when I learn I have a piece of knowledge to never again be able to know what it was like not to know that. Now, why is that relevant here? Because I think it essentially sums up the essence of communication and marketing, regardless of what industry you're in, your role you're in. If you're a professional communicator, your job day in and day out is somehow to defeat the curse of knowledge, because every time you communicate in any way with your audiences, regardless of who they are, you are coming from a place of knowledge, and you can't even imagine what it's like to be them. They don't know. Now, the most obvious version of this is like lingo and jargon, and we want to eliminate that. That's obvious, but it goes much, much deeper than this. Now, having acknowledged this, right, we think about our organization 40 hours a week. The people we're trying to talk to think about us roughly 0 hours per week. How do we bridge that curse? And there are some ways. We're going to talk about some of those ways, but I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that this is the starting place. Right? If we don't acknowledge that this is the fundamental problem we're up against, then all of the tactics in the world aren't going to save us. So with that in mind, back to the quad, we're going to talk about workflow in more detail a little bit later, but I want to acknowledge that it's such an important part of governance. I really think this quad could be a triad where it's substance, structure, and then workflow gets subsumed up underneath governance, because it really is so critical to good governance. But workflow answers the question, how will content come to be? Now, it's often mistaken for content governance. There's more that goes into governance than just workflow, but they're inextricably linked. Workflow is an element of the governance plan. It's not the governance itself. Your workflow should be as simple as possible. Your workflow should rely on roles, not on specific people. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And each type of web content might need its own workflow. I would encourage you, as you're kind of expanding your content knowledge in all sorts of directions, to begin to think of your website as a collection of content types, as opposed to a collection of web pages. The pages are just like almost an arbitrary structure. The content types are so much more relevant to all of the content work you do, the strategizing, the building, the governance, the maintenance, the writing, all of it. And what do I mean by content types? Well, if you're, again, so let's say you're a nonprofit, common types of content on a nonprofit would be a donation form, a donation case, an events module, a news module. It can take a lot of forms. If you're a university, you definitely got things like faculty directory is a content type. Admissions information is a content type. Program search, or like degree search, is a content type. If you think of it in those terms, then suddenly your website will start to seem a lot simpler and more manageable. I will say that assumes that your website is built modularly, which may not be the case. We can talk about that after. I don't want to get too in the weeds. Okay. I want to pause because I've been yakking for too long, and let Jenny talk a little bit about how they think about the quad here.
So when we started reworking our website, we really looked at the substance of our content and tried to ground it in our mission statement and let that inspire the substance, the meat of it. And so our mission is basically to produce highly desired business graduates that are going to go out there and be thought leaders. And, so how did we approach it? We really structured our content for our audiences. And so it's about pulling those prospective students in. And we recognize that current students aren't really one of our main target audiences. So we have alumni and this other portion of target audience that's kind of secondary to prospective students that we really focus on, and that's more of an advancement, and it goes full circle. So we're bringing students in, and then we're bringing our graduates back to kind of inspire our current or prospective students. And then our workflows really do vary by the type of content. So, and those workflows are always going to need reviewing. So we have news stories, and we also have what I like to call the admissions. It's actually the academic advising side, where we're really posting our curriculum models. And that section, we're always having to review and analyze how are we making sure that information is up to date and current, and has it gone through all the committees? Has it gone through and been verified and checked? And is everything accurate before we post it? And it's always subject to change. We're always changing our models based on what's happening in industry and what's happening on the ground. So 2020 was obviously one of those big moments where we had to, change how we worked. And then we have our governance, which is a continual work in progress. And I'll be honest, it's one of those things where I wish I could say we were further along and we had the perfect model for everyone. But where we started to where we are now has been such a dramatic difference in how we operate and how we focus, and just our strategy has changed entirely. So, the problems governance can solve are quite large. Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks, Jenny. I love that you mentioned that you organize your content by your audience and not your internal organization. I think universities are often guilty of that, especially government agencies are really guilty of that, of building their website around the way they think of themselves. That's a curse of knowledge at work. And they pay a lot of lip service to paying attention to their audiences, but then in the end, they name their things their audiences don't name it. They put up
right, and even after we've implemented all of our changes and we've gone through this process, we still fight that urge that people have. A program manager will come up and say, "Hey, why is this on our section of the page?" Well, it's the target audience is going to look in that area. So even now, we're still facing that.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. In fact, I'm going to move pretty quickly through this section because I want to get to the really good meaty part of this presentation. But I hope that y'all can become a bit more sort of, I don't know, dynamic advocates for content governance inside your organization by acknowledging some of the things. These are just some of the things we've seen it do here at Mighty Citizen. For a lot of you, inaccuracy is a killer. If you've got inaccurate information, it can have real effects that are significant. So governance, if done right, one of the first things it does is implement protocols to ensure that the information, especially on your website, is accurate. So that's number one. Number two, what I'll call mystery effectiveness. Do you know what's working on your site? Do you not? How do you know? Where's your proof? I mean, I assume some of you probably look at analytics dashboards or reports with some regularity. Some of you may not. Governance institutes ways that we know what's working so that we don't waste time on stuff that isn't. What I'll call unremarkableness. Listen, if you're, I believe this strongly, if you're not different, you will fail in the long run. Again, it's a thing that gets paid a lot of lip service, but often doesn't come to manifest itself in the way we, assign resources and invest in people in our organizations, which is differentiation. How are you different? If you look to your peers and competitors to guide your content strategy or your website design or any of that, you're going to end up succeeding in the way they succeed and failing in the way that they fail. You're not going to set yourself apart. So I feel like I could go off on a real soapbox there, but I'll just move on. I'm sure we've all heard the notion of silos. Again, this seems to be especially popular in government and university and associations, maybe a little less so at some nonprofits. But the notion of we're in different departments, we don't talk to each other, or we do it once a week at a staff meeting, but the collaboration is very minimal. It's not structured. It happens occasionally, and even then it's only by accident. Governance, maybe at its core, it's not about eliminating silos. Frankly, those will probably always exist because we all have our jobs to do, but it finds ways to concretize, if that's a word, to make concrete input from people who normally do not get input into things like content, marketing, communications, those kind of things. This is a big one. I would say, I might even go so far as to say, if you get nothing else from this hour, I hope it is this, that in order for your content marketing efforts to be successful over time and to grow and to thrive, et cetera, you have to invest authority in at least one person, and hopefully not more than one person. That might sound a little bit bold, but at the end of the day, we have found that unless there's one person in the organization who ultimately has the authority to say yes and no, and what I mean by that is yes and no to changes to strategy, yes and no to particular types of content, yes or no to your editorial calendar, et cetera, if you don't have that concentrated in one, maybe 2 or 3 people, depending on your size, then the whole thing just becomes a wash. And you fall back on sort of old habits, the same challenges sit there in front of you. So if you could do only one thing, I would say find the authority and invest it. Ginny, did you want to share some of your challenges with us?
Yeah, what we ran into when I came on, I was looking at our content and reading through our website, and we were literally posting our policies on things, and it read something along the lines of the student shall ... the student shall ... the parent will la la la. It was absolutely horrible and not engaging. And so we really worked on our content and changing our tone and voice and finding what that is. And then we ran into a situation where each person was sounding different. So we really had to consolidate all these voices. And then we also found that our content was outdated. It was completely inaccurate. Some of the things we had up there were 7 years old, and programs had changed, and we weren't offering those courses. So, it was a lot of work of trying to figure out what wasn't working with our content, and it seemed quite large. There was no real ownership of content. And then we also found that not only was there not any clear line of ownership, but we had a hard time defining what was really an internal communication versus an external communication. So we ran into this issue of we need to bring things out of the exterior website and really put that on our intranet. So some of those more policy-driven documents we took down and, switched our mode to true marketing on our site. And in that, move, we went from having this dry, no video, no images. I mean, it was just, the list goes on. We really had to work on making engaging content as well. And that's something that we still work on a daily basis. So.
Yeah, I think I would encourage all of you after the webinar, not now, don't go over to another tab, but definitely go check out the Harvard website, because Ginny and her team have done, I think, an excellent job of really transforming that thing. And I think it's even, I'd love to hear maybe at the very end about some of the results y'all have seen from that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I've got like 15 minutes or maybe less to get through the good stuff. So let's talk about what you need to prepare. You're right. You're like, okay, Andrew, I buy it. Governance is important. It's going to make us more efficient and lean and da, da, da. So how do I get ready? Here's what you need to do. You need 4 things. You need a content squad, a website council, a messaging platform, and a content audit. Okay, I'm gonna spend a little bit of time talking about each of these so you have a sense of what you need to do. Content squad. In other words, who do you need to make this all work? Let me first start by asking this poll question on a scale of 1 to 10. This is relevant, I promise. You don't see the question. Oh, yeah, you do. Sorry, I need to scroll up. 10 being critical, 1 being not at all critical. How critical is content marketing to accomplishing your organization's goals? That is, communicating with the world through the production of free, engaging, useful, beautiful content. How critical is that? 1 through 10, with 10 being critical. Let's see what we got here. Drum roll, please. Wow. 10. Okay, so listen, I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here. Okay, I don't need to make the case so much. I probably should have asked this question at the beginning so that I could have skipped some of this stuff and not made the case. But even for those of you who are saying, oh, it's a 2, a 3, a 4, maybe a 6, I get that. There are other ways to communicate. Often, for example, with my higher ed clients, I say, do you have a good football team? Because if you have a good football team, that's way more effective than any content marketing. So there's other ways, of course, but to the extent that producing, differentiating, free, useful content is a core part of your strategy, I want to establish that because it helps set the stage for this, which is what we believe, that you have to create content. It is the future. And I originally had a slide in here that really dug into why this was true. And it looked at sort of generational expectations, millennials and Generation Z, who for many of you are the audience you care about most, either now or will over the next 10 years, and how the shifting expectations for what happens online are significant. People expect an exceptional experience online and exceptional content. It's no longer luxury. This is a version of my boss often says design is no longer a luxury, it's the price of entry, which is also true. I would add to that great content isn't a luxury. So if you were saying it's a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, I think you might find that it becomes more of a centerpiece in the coming years as the people you're trying to communicate with fall more into those younger generations. So here's the thing. To the extent that you can, and Jenny was alluding to this earlier, but you have to foster a culture of content, right? We have to begin to get at least our portion of our organization to begin to think of ourselves as content publishers first. We are a digital content publishing house, okay? If we can get people to think from that perspective, then suddenly everything else becomes a lot clearer and easier to do. Listen, it's gonna take a couple years to turn the ship. It is a slow, messy, incremental process. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But if you have the authority, or even better, even if you don't have the authority, but you have the passion, you have a belief as content as a means of serving our customers or our users, then you can be the one beginning to nudge that ship toward the content high seas. There's some tips in here for how to do that. We want to make things as simple, as feasible, as clear as possible. We're not looking to come in to the next staff meeting and tell them that what they've been doing no longer matters and we're doing things in all new way. That wouldn't work anyway. But if you measure your efforts constantly, you make small changes over time, and you're able to invest in the human beings necessary to do that, I think you'll see the change. I know that we have. Content marketing was not a core part of our of Mighty Citizens work, but now it is, and we've seen the benefits. So who do I think you need? You need a content evangelist. We'll call this a content strategist. You can also call this the editor-in-chief for those of you who may come from the world of journalism or understand that world. This is the grand high poobah with all the authority. Remember we talked about authority again? We need, at a minimum, you need this person, okay? Then if I was hiring, who would I hire second? I would hire a writer, and not a good writer, a great writer. A great writer, an exceptional writer is the second person I would hire, because while content is a lot more than words, words come first in most content pursuits. Not all, but most still. Then I would hire a designer. Again, great, not good, if we can manage to find one and afford one. And that is because increasingly, design is also the cost of entry. Remember, you're trying to communicate with people who increasingly expect things to look beautiful and work right the first time. And it's because the apps that they spend so much of their time relying on look beautiful and work right the first time. I'm talking about Facebook and Snap and Insta and TikTok and whatever's next will work well and it will look beautiful. You want your content to read well, render well online and on screens, and look gorgeous. And then the neck and neck with the designer is an SEO expert. I'm not going to get really into SEO. That's search engine optimization. That is not only creating useful and beautiful content, but doing it in such a way that it will get you found when people type search terms into Google. And if you have someone who really knows SEO, the nuances and the trends, they can help guide your content planning so that you are not only creating stuff that is useful, but that we know and can measure that it will expand your audience. I can't emphasize enough that SEO, if you want lifelong employment, if you want permanent job security, become a true expert in SEO because it's only growing. Okay. We're gonna have to move quickly here, Jenny, but
Okay.
sorry.
So, oh no, you're fine. We have a very small communications and marketing team, so that has its own challenges. But we do have our subject matter experts that are in the college, which has allowed us to tap certain individuals within the college as content editors. And then through that, we've set up the editors, but then we also have the content approvers. So there is a final say. We do check for tone, voice, whether or not we're matching our style guide. And then because we're small, we have a very tiny, small creative team in-house, but we rely mostly on vendors for our work. And so we have to be kind of flexible and be able to use tools whenever possible. So for SEO, we are using a lot of tools. We don't have an SEO expert. We do use Site Improve. We're checking our Google Analytics. And then we do have a search tool that's embedded in our website that kind of provides us with insight to what people are searching on our site and gives us some really neat insight to that. But
yeah, Jenny's being humble here. She is a one-person wrecking crew for them. I mean, she definitely has support and help, but yeah, if you go to the Harvard site, that's like 99% Jenny right there. Okay, website council. This is the next thing you need. So you got your internal squad. Now you got to go form a council, and you're like, Andrew, enough with the councils or the committees, especially if you're a nonprofit. You're like, we already have like 10 of those. Well, welcome to your 11th committee then. The website council, and you can call this other things, content council, content strategy council, but it really is a volunteer-based council whose purpose is to oversee and enhance your content strategy over time. And notice I said content strategy. This is not a council that is, examining every piece of thing you publish or every plan you have to publish something that is way too in the weeds, way too tactical. They're meeting, maybe once a quarter. We've seen it work once a semester for higher ed, maybe once every 6 months. They get together for a few hours. They're reviewing things like high-level website analytics, content initiative progress. Someone's reporting to them. This is what we've been doing for the last 3 months. Here's what we got coming up for the next 3 to 6 months. What do you think? We want your input because y'all represent different parts of our organization. If you're a small nonprofit with only 6 staff members, your website council might be you, a board member, a key volunteer, and your ED. If you're at a huge university that's across, thousands of employees across dozens of departments, well, maybe you've got a representative from each major department. You got a few communication folks, you've got an IT person. You just want some diversity of thought so that you are making sure that the curse of knowledge that you suffer from isn't preventing you from seeing key opportunities and not just opportunities to do things, but opportunities to stop doing things that aren't working. Again, you can see, I'm going to move past this because I just kind of said all this, but the website council, I think, is technically optional, but if you want your governance to really sing, to be a sort of a, well-oiled machine that doesn't require a ton of time and it does not dragging you down and boring you to death, the council is a really great way to do it. And we find that people actually love volunteering for this because they want to have a say in how their organization communicates itself to the world. Okay, number 3, messaging platform. I alluded to this earlier. This is a term that we use at Mighty Citizen. Some other folks call it different things, but it's essentially a document that establishes consensus on the different ways to communicate the organization's value and the priority of those messages. Okay, let me show you what's in it. These are just cover sheets from a couple that we've done recently for some clients, but this is not the full table of contents, by the way. The full messaging platform usually has 12 to 15 sections. I just pulled out about 7 of them, but it's a way of establishing consensus. And what I mean by that is like, okay, team, hey, organization, this is exactly how we all feel. What our core values are. This is our unique value proposition. These are the problems we solve. These are the benefits we provide. The words in the messaging platform really matter. If you don't have a messaging platform or some version of this, and you try to go develop a content strategy, then you're just going to be throwing tactics at the wall that have no guiding purpose, right? So messaging platform, very, very important, and frankly, very, very fun to create. Okay, last thing you need to prep is a content audit. You can find all sorts of great resources on our website, a Mighty Citizen, for this. But in short, what is an audit? There's really 2 varieties. It's either an inventory or an evaluation of every page, or at least a good representative portion of pages on your website. You have to conduct a website audit before you do any major updates to your strategy or governance plan. And that's because you have to know what you're working with, right? In order to know what to drop, what to keep, and what to enhance. It's going to save you time in the end because you'll have a single reliable source to know what's on your site. It's going to save you money by saving you time. It's going to serve your users better by getting them what they need and what they want and getting it to them more quickly and efficiently. And it's going to make sure that as you enhance your strategy, especially through your web council, they're going to know what works, what doesn't, and what you have. It's going to make their work especially a lot easier. And by the way, the mere process of conducting a website audit is really half of the value, because it forces you to reckon with some real fundamental questions that you probably have never reckoned with, or at least haven't thought about in years. You probably need an external auditor. That's because of the curse of knowledge. You can do rolling audits. In other words, gosh, there's 5,000 pages on our site. It'll take us forever to look at every one of those. Okay, do 100 for now, do 100 next quarter, do 100 a quarter after that, and we'll just roll it and keep it rolling over the years. You want to share this with your leadership, your executive directors, your board members. It can be impressive just to look at the audit. If you can include Google Audit, key Google Analytic numbers, right? Visitors, bounce rate, things like that. This is what an audit might look like. I know it can be kind of hard to take in because it's kind of squeezed in here. It's a spreadsheet, right? It's just a spreadsheet. We have actually made this template that you can just literally steal and use for your own website. You can see the URL there, and we'll share that with you in the follow-up email if you want to go download this spreadsheet. We've also filled in a couple example lines for you there, but basically you're just answering questions like, what is the page called? What's the URL? What's the audience? What's the purpose? What's the user action? And again, you begin to imagine by how to just answering these kind of simple, basic questions, it allows us to go, you know what, that thing is so old, or you know what, that's not quite in the right tone, or that's aimed at the wrong audience, or this uses some weird jargon. And if you don't do this work, often that kind of thinking never actually takes place. I know Jenny, definitely during the website redesign, we did one of these. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to share on it?
Oh, yeah. So when we initially did our content audit, and this was 2018, we found that not only did we have orphans and, just a huge number of pages that were unattended to, we were repeating content and there was no one true source of information. And then, of course, there was the golden nuggets that were buried really deep and we're not getting any there were no views on them because they were buried so many layers deep in our site. So it really gave us a way to show everyone in the department and in the college how unorganized and how it had just kind of grown into this monster of a website, with all these tendrils everywhere. And it really helped us get buy-in across the college for a complete and total overhaul of the site, not just content wise, but like design wise as well, because it really required a whole structural revamp.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you raised a good point. The idea of getting buy-in, even just by looking at an audit spreadsheet, it can be like, wow, look at all this that we've got.
It's a big O moment. It's that's what we have. Yeah,
okay.
We need to do something about that.
Yeah, right. Okay, so here's the situation, y'all. I got a whole last section here. We're already at 56 after the hour. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to continue talking. If you need to go, please go. I apologize for us not getting this. We are going to send you not only the deck with all the notes, but we'll also send you the recording so you can jump to the last 10 minutes if you need to leave now. We'll also stay over by a few minutes to answer questions. So if you're like, I don't got a meeting to go to and you want to stick around for another 10 to 15 minutes where I'm going to keep talking, I apologize again. This was our first version of this, and I think we got a little overly ambitious with our slides. So we're going to keep going. And this is the last section. And I want to talk about what we consider to be the 4 pieces of a content governance plan that you need, no matter what your content strategy or your industry. The first is a core content statement. This is sort of aligns with the core strategy we talked about earlier. Again, the core content statement should be a sentence or 2 or 3 that describes how all content should be in service of specific goals that your organization has. We've all heard about SMART goals. They don't necessarily have to be smart in that official way, but they do need to be somewhat specific. Your core content statement should be flexible, meaning you can change it in a year if you need to. It should be slightly aspirational, right? Maybe 15% more than you think you can accomplish right now. It should be open to input for anyone in your organization, including your board members, if you have those, if that's relevant to you. And it should be as short as possible while still containing everything it needs to contain. And finally, written in real life. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to move straight to this. Okay, if we're going to put this in a formula, there are 3 parts that I would put into the formula, right? 1, what content will we make? 2, for whom or for whom's, if there's multiple audiences, and then so that they can blank. And that's where you put in your aspirational goals for them. So what are we going to create, for whom, and basically what will that do for them? Let me show you an example here. This is an example from that book we mentioned earlier. The core content statement is we're going to curate an entertaining online reference guide that helps stressed out law students become successful practicing attorneys. That's a beautiful statement because it does a few key things. First, it talks about what we're going to create, an online reference guide, okay? It's going to say who we help, stressed out law students, and what it's going to do for them. It's going to make them successful practicing attorneys. And notice the very beginning too, curate as opposed to create. Now, why is that different? Because for some organizations, it makes way more sense to gather content from around the internet or around their user base and publish that. as opposed to writing everything in-house. If you're a small team, you can get a lot of mileage out of having some really engaged users or volunteers or board members who are willing to help you find or even write or create new content. So I don't want to ignore that, but that's an example of a core content statement. And why do you need that? Because that is the guiding light of your governance. Everything that goes into a governance plan should feed up to that. Then you need workflows for each major type of content you produce. Workflows sound like they might be complex. They do not actually need to be, even for complex organizations. In essence, a workflow is the sequence through which a piece of content passes from ideation or initiation all the way to completion or publication. Let me show you what I mean. You're going to have different job roles in your organization, and each of them is going to play at least one or maybe multiple roles in the workflow. And this is just some examples, by the way. This is not some official list or anything, but if you have a content strategist or an editor-in-chief, they're going to be doing everything from inventing ideas, strategizing, governing, evaluating. But then you're going to have people like subject matter experts. Maybe it's a faculty member or a board member or your ED, right? They know stuff and you're trying to get it out of them. All they're doing is helping you come up with ideas, consulting, maybe doing some editing of what you write. So you identify the roles that get a piece of content from ideation to publication. And then simply your content governance publishes it for each type. So for example, if one of my content types is a request enrollment information form, this is often called request info on a university site, some version of that. So that's a type of content, right? So what do I want to do with that page or that form in order to make sure I create it well, maintain it well, and publish it accurately? Well, here's each step, right? This is what a workflow looks like for each content type. So the content governance document, I would say is at least 50% this. It's at least 50% workflows. And I would encourage you to keep it as simple as possible. We learned years ago when we started doing this, that if you make it really complex with a bunch of steps and rules, that it's just not going to take root. People are too busy doing their daily jobs to learn a whole new way of doing a whole bunch of stuff. So we try to keep it as simple as and short as feasible. So you can see the steps there. We're requesting an update. Who can do that? Who's going to craft the content on the page? Who's going to implement the page in the content management system itself? Who's going to review it in the content management system? Who's going to test it? Probably again in the content management system. In other words, test that the form works, test that it's all accurate, that it's all there. And then finally, who gets to decide that it gets published? And these are just example roles. Now, notice we don't have people's names. We've seen content governance plans where they're like, oh, well, Sally does that and Robert does that. Do not put that in your content governance plan, because what happens when Sally quits or Robert leaves or retires, right? So you need those workflows. I know, Jenny, you have some experience in this, and really just with the whole cultural shift, right?
Yeah, so we really had to, work with a group that we had a lot of silos to break down, basically. So through that, adoption was slow. And we found that communication, not only up and down the ladder, but we had to communicate with people on the same level, with other groups that program managers, and really get them buying into this whole process and making this a better site. With that, so some of those workflows where you're saying, we have a huge chain of people that it needs to go through, or roles that we need to go through. Sometimes with smaller teams, you're going to find that you're not only the reviewer, but you're also the editor, you're checking it, you're publishing it. It's still good to know the steps that you need to take, because having that framework for a reference just helps you moving forward. And it's something that maybe you only do it once a year. Maybe it's an update that you don't do frequently. So having that as a reference and being able to look to it and say, hey, that's what I need to do today. It really makes it much easier and
Yeah.
repeatable, so,
Repeatable. That's such a good
yeah.
point. That so much of governance plan is about making sure that stuff doesn't stay orphaned on our site and doesn't get attended to. We haven't looked at it in here. Okay, it's time for us to go look at it. Okay, last couple things, and then we'll end it and take questions if there are any. A branding guide and a copy style guide. I'm sure most of you are familiar with one or both of these. I'm going to skip past the poll for now. The branding guide is, you can see sort of some screenshots of one we did recently there. The reason this has to go into the governance plan is because so much of what good governance is like, what is the standard against which we are measuring what we're doing, right? And by the way, here's what we think absolutely has to be included in a branding guide for it to be useful to your governance efforts. A summary of what it's there for: logo usage rules, color palette, typography, and photography and illustration rules. At a minimum, you should have those, because that is what a website is. It's a collection of logos, colors, typography, and photography and illustration. And why that you need this is so that it's all in one place, right? Easily accessible, easily transparent. It's not something you create once and forget about somewhere in your file directory. It's there in the content governance plan so that we can measure what we're doing up against the standards we're trying to maintain. Why is it valuable? Because, again, established rules, it creates visual consistency. Remember, this is becoming the expectation. And if your logo is not used correctly somewhere, it further suggests to users that you're not as buttoned up or professional, as trustworthy as you should be. And of course, it allows you to identify shortcomings or necessary changes, right? Maybe you need to make some changes to your branding. Similarly, a copy style guide can serve an important purpose. Often what people say is, oh, well, we just do AP style, or we just do Chicago style or MLA or whatever. And when clients ask me, should we just do that and just say, we just follow those rules? I say yes, but only if you have the guide and it's available to everybody, right? A lot of people say AP style guide, but they don't have the guide. You got to buy the guide, okay? You have to have at least one person who knows it pretty well, has read it, or at least referenced it a bunch and has a sense of what it means to be AP style. And you identify places where your copy should diverge. And this is a key thing. In the content governance plan, you can say, here at, blank charity, we follow AP style rules. That means we italicize the titles of things and we don't use the serial comma, et cetera, et cetera. But then you want to identify where you diverge from it. So we think that you have to include an executive summary, voice and tone, grammar rules, things like, do we use passive versus active voice? What are our formatting rules, right? Do we use numbered lists, bulleted lists? When you use bulleted lists, should they be little circles or little squares? All of these things matter to establishing consistent brand identity, right? Things like case rules, what we capitalize, what we don't. If we're a university, do we capitalize the word university or do we not? Industry and organizational language, jargon, lingo, where we use it, when we don't use it, when can we use acronyms? Again, this is in the weeds stuff. And it doesn't help just to say it once and put it in the content governance plan. You have to have that person, that authority, and that evangelist who knows this stuff so that there's a human reference. Because I guarantee you, if you don't have at least one person who has a good sense of how your governance rules, your workflows go, your branding, your copy style, your audit, et cetera. If you don't have that, then a lot of this is just going to be an exercise that happens once and then lies inert in your file system. I'm not going to go through this right now because we're already over time, but if you want to read some examples of the difference between voice and tone, you can read it there. But I just, do some key takeaways here. I want you to think of governance as critical because the context of the things you put into the world as an organization matters at least as much as the things you put into the world. You need a larger content strategy before you try to do governance. Without it, your governance plans are sort of laddering up to nothing. Governance can solve key communication problems, though, especially around website, social, email, all of your digital channels. If you get the right people, you form a council, you create a messaging platform, and you conduct an audit, you can do governance almost in your sleep, because then things like strategy, workflows, branding, copy, all of that just gets created almost automatically because you have the right people at the helm. Again, I'm so sorry for those of you who are still with us that we went over. But we do have the slides and other free tools and templates, totally free, at mightycitizen.com/content-gov. We will follow up with an email with links to all these documents. I do want to give a shout out to Harbert and Jenny. She was so helpful joining us today and giving us some real practical insight. If you're looking for executive MBA, you can do much, much worse than Auburn Business School. I can say that personally. So with that said, I'm going to shut up. You can see our contact information there. Feel free to reach out to either of us. And for those of you who are still hanging in there, still with us, Brianna, did we have any questions we might want to try to tackle real quick?
We do. We have a few. So I
Okay.
will just dig right in.
All right.
How do you handle competing experts/opinions? One expert/opinion says the web needs to look like this, while another says it needs to look like that.
Oh, that's a good one. Okay. So my first question would be like, well, what makes them experts? Like, what do you mean? Like, you have two different vendors who are working on your website, or these two people in your organization? Like, you have a graphic designer versus a IT person. So I would want to first know, like, where are they coming from? But let's assume that wherever they're coming from, they actually know their stuff. They know modern website design rules, content rules, etc. That's why I would say it's so critical to have an authority, because what happens, we see it all the time in these large decentralized organizations, which is we do have different expert opinions, and because there's no centralized authority who can make executive decisions, then things slow down, things don't get done, weird politics start to play, like, I'm friends with this person, so I'm going to listen to them, stuff like that we've seen. So I don't know if there's a one size fits all for how to, handle two competing opinions from two different experts. But I would say the first thing I would look to do is figure out who has the final authority. And then, of course, you can always email me, because I love geeking out about this stuff, and I will totally try to help you settle the debate over who's right about some website question.
There's actually a question that goes along with this pretty well.
Yeah.
Is what department or business area should be the primary owner or champion of content governance? Do you have a recommendation?
Did you say what industry you're talking about, or what kind of organization?
What department or business area should be the primary owner?
Well, I mean, it should be your marketing or communications team. I know different industries have different terms for who that is. Some places hate the word marketing. I know government tries not to use that word. They call it communications or constituent relations or something like that. Whoever is responsible for communicating at scale to the world. Now, I would say if you're a nonprofit, that often takes the form of some combination of communications and development. Sometimes that's the same person. Gosh knows, early in my career, I worked for a very tiny nonprofit where the development person was the marketing person. But if you're a little bit bigger and those roles are specialized, often it's a pretty close collaboration, because the whole purpose of communication most of the time in a nonprofit is to raise money. So, and then at the university level, then you definitely have a communications department. Although, man, I'll tell you, if you're a university person still on the line, I feel for you, because it is, and I feel for Jenny, because I've never seen anything more difficult than higher ed communications to get your there's just.
Well, in our recent directive, I'm in the Office of Communications and Marketing with the Harvard College of Business, but recently we've been combined with development, and we are starting to focus more on alumni and donor relations, and those communication channels. So
Yeah, suddenly you're like
struggle is real. The struggle is real. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay.
It's pretty straightforward. Would you recommend doing this as part of the larger strategic plans of an organization?
Yes, ideally, yes. Although I would say that I would be tempted to, if I'm going to do sort of a ground up facelift overhaul to either my website or my whole approach to marketing or communication, if that's what we're talking about here, creating a new content strategy, I would be tempted to do that work first and get that thing really up on its feet before worrying about governance. Because so much of governance is like, how do we work? How do we work? Who do we have? How big are we? How do we work? What workflows can we sustain? What does our council look like? And you're not going to be able to really know that probably until you see how the content strategy itself gets developed. So I would do that work first, and maybe like 6 months, a year later, after that is sort of officially, quote, launched, then I would begin building out my governance plan.
All right. Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's we'll cut it here at 3:15. Thank you both. This is great conversation. Lots of important information. I shared the content-gov website in the chat, but we'll also have some tools along with the recording and the slides sent to you tomorrow. And then also when you leave the webinar, we have a post-webinar survey. So we hope you'll take a minute to let us know what you think. We take the feedback very seriously, and we work to improve and update our future webinars and topics.
Yeah, like for example, was this webinar too long?
Should have been split up maybe. But no, yeah, we really appreciate it. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Jenny. And
thank you.
Bye-bye.